Hey, man.
Hi, both. Good morning.
Hey, Val.
Hey, good morning.
How's your son, Abel?
Oh,
Ooh-ha!
Not good.
Is it too high of a fever, or it's just like a regular?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the first session of the BITS Open Research Seminar. We're absolutely delighted that you're here. I'm Ted Miguel. I'm a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm the faculty director of BITS and also of CIGA, the Center for Effective Global Action. BITS, the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, was established 10 years ago in 2012 with a goal of improving the credibility of science by advancing transparency, reproducibility, rigor, and ethics in research. And BITS does this in a few different ways. First, we generate evidence about problems and solutions in science through meta research led by BITS investigators and the broader community. We strengthen the scientific ecosystem, for example, by developing open science policies, protocols, and platforms that enable open science at scale. And we increase access to open science education, for example, through webinars like this one, as well as our flagship research transparency and reproducibility trainings, RT2. And this open research seminar, ORS, is one of several education initiatives that we've launched. I'd like to acknowledge up front that we're co-hosting this series with the Berkeley Library, and that the ORS is generously supported by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. So we're very grateful to their partnership and support. This is a new webinar series that aims to promote and share knowledge about the use of tools and practices for transparency and reproducibility in social science research. So far for this fall, we've scheduled 4 online sessions. Today's session is the life cycle of a reproduction, from ex-ante documentation to ex-post reproduction and beyond, featuring the speakers that you'll hear from in a few minutes. On October 27th, we have our next seminar. It's called Normalizing Reproducibility, the Experience of the World Bank Group and DIME, which will be featuring several of our colleagues from the World Bank. On November 17th, there's a webinar called Hashed Linkages for Administrative Datasets with Carla Palos Castellanos of the California Policy Lab based here at Berkeley. And finally, for this fall series on December 6th, there's a webinar called How to Evaluate Journal Implementation of Open Science Standards, the Trust Process, led by Sean Grant of Indiana University. So please see the event website for more details on the Open Research Seminar. And if you want to get broader updates about BITS, make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter. You can access this through our homepage, bits.org, or by following us on Twitter. I also want to say, for those who are here live now or who are watching this recording, we received many interesting proposals for research seminars through this series from researchers, practitioners, and students from all around the world, actually. And we encourage those who weren't selected for this first round of talks this fall to apply again for the second round of webinars, which is going to take place in the winter and spring of 2023. So please stay tuned for an announcement about that soon. What I'd like to do now is hand over to the moderator of today's session, Dr. Ann Nurse. Ann is a professor of sociology at the College of Worcester and executive committee member of Project TIER, and she specializes in criminology, inequality, and research methods. Ann earned her undergraduate degree at the University of California, Berkeley, with majors in social welfare and anthropology, and her graduate degrees in sociology at the University of California at Davis. So Ann, please take it away, and thanks for hosting today's webinar.
Thank you for the introduction, and I am absolutely delighted to be here. I became interested in reproducibility many years ago and was able to attend a workshop at Project TIER. Since then, I've incorporated it into all of my courses. I teach undergraduate statistics courses, and it's really changed the way I teach and the way I see data. So I was very honored to be asked to take part in this panel today. One of the exciting things about reproducibility is the whole spectrum of how it's done. And we're going to hear about that today, from setting up a reproducibility package at the beginning of one's research to reproduction of other people's work after it's already been published. So thus the title, The Life Cycle of Reproducibility. We have 3 speakers, and I think I will introduce them one at a time. And they'll each talk for about 20 minutes. We're going to hold off questions until the end. We're going to be sure to leave lots of time for questions. So we're going to start first with Richard Ball. He runs, along with Norm Medeiros, Project TIER, which is what I've been involved with. He's a professor of economics at Haverford College. His primary teaching areas are game theory and statistical methods. His research has included theoretical papers on political economy and empirical work on development and social issues. His undergraduate degree is from Williams College in cultural anthropology and African studies. His MS from Michigan State University in agricultural economics and his PhD at my alma mater also, the University of California at Berkeley in agriculture and resource economics. He has studied and worked in a wide range of places around the world, including Sierra Leone, Chad, and Egypt. I could go on and on about Project TEAR, but better to hand it over to the expert. And he'll tell us about Project TEAR and about starting reproducibility from the beginning. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you very much, Anne. I appreciate that. And thanks very much to Iman and everybody at BITS who did a lot of work to get this organized. That's really beautifully done. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts of mine. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'll kick off this tag team webinar about the life cycle of reproduction by talking about ex ante documentation. And the first thing I'd like to do is just like clarify exactly what we mean by these two things, ex ante documentation versus ex post reproduction. And I'm very happy this is being addressed explicitly, because a lot of things get thrown into the pot and called replication or reproduction, and sometimes they mean very different things. And these are two things that have been conflated in the past. So just sorting out what's what, I think, is valuable. So by ex ante documentation, what I mean is a package of data and code and supporting information that can be used to reproduce, to do a computational reproduction of the results presented in a research paper. And this documentation is produced by the author of the paper, and they construct it while they're doing the research. And then when they distribute the paper, they distribute with it this package of reproduction materials. That's ex ante documentation. And then ex post reproduction, that's a different enterprise. That's conducted independently by a reader who would like to really engage with an existing research paper that somebody else wrote. And the broad idea is the reader, reproducer tries to get the data that was used for the paper, do all the cleaning and processing necessary to prepare it for the analysis, and then to conduct the analysis or implement those procedures that generated results reported in the paper. So that's what we call ex post reproduction. And now, this is just a brief comment, because this is the area that the next speakers are going to focus on, but just to sort of acknowledge it, that there are many varieties of ex post reproductions, from the most basic, just seeing whether when this independent person gets the data and tries to do the analysis, do they get the same results? But then it can be elaborated in many ways to go on to sensitivity analysis, extensions, using different data, what have you. And that I won't say more about that, because that's what our next speakers specialize in. Okay, so the perspective I bring to this is really, my perspective comes from that of an educator or a teacher. And so and in particular, a teacher who teaches ex ante documentation to students. And it's out of that experience as an instructor that Project TEAR developed. And the focus of Project TEAR is ex ante documentation. And the idea is that computational reproducibility achieved via ex ante documentation, that should be integrated throughout the quantitative methods curriculum for undergraduates and graduate students in the social sciences. And to put it even more, a little more forcefully maybe, here's how we think of a vision that sort of guides us in our purpose. So we would like to see a world in which at every stage of a student's quantitative methods training, from the very first time they produce a bar graph or do a t-test in their introductory statistics course, through every level up through doctoral dissertation, students should, number one, they should be working with scripts. So it's like ixnay on the oint and click tape. So working with scripts and then producing ex ante documentation that reproduces everything they do. So it could be, if it's your first stats homework and you do make a bar graph and do a t-test, then you turn in your printed paper with your work and a script that has those few commands to do that. And then that develops as the nature of the projects develop. So that should be the default from the beginning. And that's simply the way you do things, not like a special topic. Okay, and so the programs that Project Tier does have included a number of different things: faculty development workshops, curriculum writing retreats. A number of projects that we do are just sort of on demand. People get in touch with us and we do some kind of consultation or training for them. And on our website, we have various curricular materials, including some exercises and demos, course syllabi from a number of faculty members at a number of institutions, and samples of their actual student work that exemplify the kinds of things students can do. And then finally, the tier protocol, which is really what most of all the rest is centered upon. And so what is the tier protocol? So it's a detailed set of guidelines for what should be included in the ex ante documentation for a research paper. So it's very similar in spirit and content to the AEA data editors policy that's been produced in the last couple of years. It's very similar in nature to the World Bank's DIME standards that the next of these seminars is going to be about. Both of those things also give very concrete guidance about how to document your research to ensure reproducibility. Now, the tier protocol has also, sort of what's distinctive about it is that it has features that are intended to serve pedagogical purposes, to break things down so that students see how all the pieces of what they're doing fit together. And there's a little more structure and specificity in how the tier protocol says to do things compared to the AEA data editor and the World Bank, for example, because students need that help. I think whereas, someone who's an experienced researcher might see a lot of specificity and structure as intrusive. They have their own way to do it. Why can't they do it their way? But for students just learning it, they they need that structuring of it. Nature of the beast. Here's what you have to produce and archive and post with your business to post with your paper to make sure everything's reproducible. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just, I'll give you a quick look on the website. So here's what the tier protocol looks on the website, and it's really summarized here in this menu on the left, which looks a little complicated, but it's not really that complicated. because really what it involves is one main project folder that everything goes in. And then that's got 3 subfolders: data, scripts, and output. And that's all there is to it. And there then various subcategories and what have you, but it's a simple, this looks like a kind of big hierarchy of stuff, but it's really simple idea: data, scripts, and output. And this is easily navigable to any particular component that you want to read about. You can, if you want to read about the README file, there'll be details about that. So that's where it is. Now, sort of in the typical workshops we do, we spend a long time going through what all the pieces are and how they work, and that's obviously not what the purpose is this morning. But for people who might want to explore this, I'll suggest 2 things. One, you can look at this TIER protocol online, and also you'll find on the website a link to what we call a demo project, which is a short kind of sample paper with some data that has some figures and tables in it, with complete documentation constructed for it that sort of matches perfectly this theme of the TIER protocol that's laid out there. And that's the way to get a good idea about how everything works. Read the specifications in the protocol and then look at how it's embodied in that demo project. And then I think things become very clear. Okay, so that's the TIER protocol. And now, okay, so what's the relationship between ex-ante documentation and ex-post reproduction? In fact, I have 2 particular questions that I want to ask. Here's one, maybe interesting. Does ex-ante documentation make ex-post reproduction obsolete? Question 1. And question 2 is ex-ante documentation of ex-post reproduction. What does that mean? And does that make sense? So let me address both of those things. So let's first talk about why this first question: why would ex-ante documentation make ex-post reproduction obsolete? Well, if it was the norm that everybody who wrote a research paper made a really nice reproduction package that anybody else come along and open it up and run the scripts and reproduce all the results, boom, what's left to do for a reproduction? That would be, that should be very easy, automatic, run the scripts. What's left to do? Well, and so in that sense, would ubiquitous ex-ante documentation make the whole ex-post reproduction enterprise obsolete? And so here's the question: does it make it obsolete? And the answer is no, it does not. And in fact, quite the opposite. Good ex-ante documentation can really contribute to ex-post reproduction being creative and valuable and instructive. The thing that ex-ante documentation makes routine and automatic is doing exactly what the authors did. And that's good. The authors already did it. Why do you have to reinvent the wheel? That should be automatic. But then you can get on right away to what I call like the good stuff that Fernando and Abel are going to talk about, checking robustness and exploring extensions and what have you. So that seems like a way that there's a very complementary synergy between ex-ante documentation and ex-post reproduction. And what do we mean by ex ante documentation of ex post reproduction? What's the idea? So look, when you do a reproduction, people often write an article about the reproduction saying, okay, we had this paper, then we went and got the data from here, and we couldn't find the code anywhere, so we wrote this code, and then here are the tables that we got, and we compare them to the other table. Well, all of that should be documented. So that if I'm interested in the ex post reproduction, I can go and run the scripts that they wrote and see that, you know, they say they generated this table, they compare it to the published table. I should be able to use their scripts to generate their version of the table. And so just as if you're doing any research project, producing a nice, good ex ante documentation, a nice reproduction package is an important thing to do if you're doing an ex post reproduction. And either I haven't used all my time, or Anne is being greatly forbearing, but those are the points I wanted to make, and I'll be happy to turn it over.
It was perfect timing, Richard, actually. All right, so let's move on to our second speaker. Fernando Ose de la Guardia is from the Berkeley Institute for Transparency and Social Science. And he is also an affiliate of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. He works on bridging research to policy gaps in regard to transparency and reproducibility, and improving the computational reproducibility of economics research. He has led trainings, reproducibility trainings in the US, South America, and Europe. He received his PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee Rand Graduate School, where his research also focused on increasing the transparency and reproducibility of policy analysis. Before Rand, he studied economics and conducted impact evaluations and economic analyses of various social policies. So let me hand things over to Fernando.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the nice introduction. So I'm gonna share my screen now. All right, so very nice to be here in such a good presence with people from Project TIER and also from the Institute for Replication. I'm going to be talking about a project that we have been working quite for a while now at BITS, which is the Social Science Reproduction Platform, or the SSRP, as we call it affectionately, and how does it fit in this life cycle of reproducibility. So we have talked basically these are the three presenters today, and basically, as Richard said, he focused on the ex ante part. I'm going to focus more on the ex post and a little bit of beyond, but basically the extensive part of going beyond is going to be more the job of the Institute for Replication. So basically, my takeaway from Project TIER's talk is that we should document and test well our work as researchers, preferably using the Project TIER protocol, so others can easily inspect and learn from our entire scholarly contribution. And entirely scholarly contribution is illustrated in this meme here on the right, that it's not only the manuscript, which is sort of like the top of the iceberg, but also the entire reproduction package, which is the vast majority of the contribution. So conclusion from Richard's talk, let's share the entire iceberg and when producing new research. But the key question is, what about research that has already been published? And that's where we come in. Our motivation is that every year, every semester, in hundreds of courses around the world, students take courses in applied or empirical something in labor economics, social psychology, what have you, in social sciences. And And a typical assignment consists of reproducing the result of a paper and maybe testing the robustness of its results. And this is this process basically can be seen as a standard process where there are several stages. And in each stage, there's a generation of knowledge. So in the first stage, the student or the reproducer is going to verify that there's data and code. That is knowing that nowadays it's more easy because it's typically accompanied in the journal, but as far as you go far in the past, you might need to find the data and code in the author's website or somewhere else, and it can be harder to verify that data and code exists. So the reproducer generates knowledge by verifying that. Then the reproducer assesses the degree of reproducibility of the paper. So it might be completely reproducible, or somewhere in between. And this assessment, again, it is knowledge, valuable knowledge generated by a student. On top of that, while doing this reproduction, they might improve the reproduction materials. They could do simple things like fixing paths, updating libraries, adding missing files, rewriting the script in a different language, incorporating the tier protocol such that it's easier to inspect the materials, and things like that. More knowledge has been generated. And finally, once the machine is running, basically, is it possible to generate alternative specifications and see how the results change? Particularly if the results don't change, that is valuable knowledge. The results of the paper don't change to new specifications, but that's not going to go into a paper. So again, this is knowledge that is generated, and until now, it has basically lost. It has been lost every semester. At best, it's in a presentation or in a final report, but it's basically each new semester students arrive and they have they have to reinvent the wheel. Why? Because until now there was not a centralized ways to archive this knowledge, and also there was lack of standardization, as we have heard and will continue to hear. We talk about replication and reproduction in different ways. We talk about what does robustness mean in different ways. What does high degree of reproducibility means in different ways. So we need some standardization. We need to agree on some terms here across courses around the world, such that we can more systematically collect this knowledge. So that's basically our contribution. That's what we aim to do at the Social Science Reproduction Platform. And the first stage, we start by defining how much of a paper are you going to reproduce. If you get an assignment that says, please reproduce paper X, that's a pretty broad assignment. You need to have a more narrow description of what are you going to aim at reproducing. We use this figure to conceptualize the idea that a paper has many claims and have many findings, and each finding is going to be supported by different display items, tables, or figures, and each of those is going to be supported by one specification, one main specification that's sort of like where the claim rests. So when you're going to reproduce something, instead of saying go reproduce the paper, we're trying to make it a little bit more granular and say go reproduce, define the claim that you're going to reproduce, and identify where is the supporting evidence for that claim. So how do you do that? You go to a social science reproduction platform, you create an account, you log in, and you get started, and you go through these different stages. I'm going to focus right away on stage number 1. The first stage is stage 0. It's about selecting the paper. It's important, but rather self-explanatory. Stage 1 about scoping. Basically, this is when you start reading the paper. And this is an important distinction, that we don't think that you should read a paper until you have make sure that there is a reproduction package. Otherwise, be cautious about investing so much time on a paper if you're going to try to reproduce something where there's nothing on it. But once you start reading it, subjectively, you're going to have to pin down what the main claim is, the main claim is of the paper, or the main claims. So in this case, I have found the claim in the results section of a paper. Then I go into the display items, and I find that in table 2, the column 2 contains the main specification, but I also see an alternative specification that could be valuable. And then I go into the reproduction, into the social science reproduction platform. I write in my own words what is my interpretation of this claim. I type what are the estimates associated with this claim, and then I move on. I go to the next stage. So again, it's a lot of standardization, a lot of trying to facilitate that we all speak the same language when doing this work. So then you move into assessing the paper, and assessing the paper probably is the most subjective stage. So to assess the paper, you're going to open the folder, the reproduction packages. You're going to look at the materials. You might figure out, if you're lucky, you're going to find a README file. The README file might point you out what the main file is to reproduce table 2. Remember, we're going after table 2 here. And the SSRP has some nice tools to allow you to sort of build this reproduction tree that we call, that allow you to see how all the pieces interact to produce the final table. And once you basically have been able to identify what are the key pieces in your reproduction, you're going to try to run all these steps and see how it goes, see the result, and according to the result, assess the reproducibility of the paper. And how would you assess it? We suggest a scale that moves away from binary judgments of reproducible and irreproducible, and focuses on a degree that allows improvements over time, that goes from having no materials whatsoever to being completely reproducible from raw data. The middle of the scale, it's being able to reproduce something from the analysis data, and then it's gonna progress from having some amount of code, some amount of data, from no materials to analysis, and then from analysis to raw data. And we think that this scale is gonna allow improvements, and also a common understanding of what certain levels of reproducibility mean. With that, then you can move into improvements. As a reproducer, you have learned about these reproduction materials. This work might have been done 3, 5, 10 years ago. You can bring in better programming practices, better software packages. For example, you can, if you were to reproduce anything that I did, I don't know, 10 years ago, you would definitely, 5 years ago, you would definitely have to bring the tier protocols to my work. I would have like data in one corner of my computer, scripts in another corner, and they were never under the same project folder. So it's very valuable to have everything under one project folder, separated in different subfolders that are self-explanatory and things like that. You can improve certain things about a specific display items. You can also might run out of time. This might be a 2-week homework, might be a 1-month homework or semester homework, but you have also generated knowledge on what are the things that you would have improved if you would have had an extra week, an extra month, or something like that. So you can leave messages saying, hey, future reproducer that comes after me, don't reinvent the wheel, focus on this file that I think can be improved in X, Y, and Z ways. So you can leave specific improvements for future reproducers, so such that there's an incremental process of generating knowledge. And once you're done with improvement, then you can move into the robustness section. The robustness section, I think that we have built the platform in a way that it facilitates 2 types of contributions. One, it could be that you are a researcher that they're basically just learning about this topic of the paper. You don't have that much subject matter expertise, and you feel like you cannot contribute with a novel modification on the analysis. That's totally fine. But you can contribute, for example, in pinning down where are the key analytical choices in the code. So you can, even as an undergraduate student, you can go through the code and say, hey, these regressions are the ones that go into the table. or this is this section where we are subsetting the data set given these conditions. This is an analytical choice, or when we are aggregating all these variables into one index, another analytical choice, basically collecting those analytical choices and adding them to the SSRP such that others can come after you and see where the analytical choices are. That's one type of contribution. Another type of contribution is to, once you have more subject matter expertise, justify some alternative robustness checks. And what do I mean by that? When thinking about robustness checks, we think of this diagram where a paper, we're going to assume that all, first of all, we're going to define a robustness check as any possible change in computational choice, both in data analysis and data cleaning. So it's a pretty big universe. Almost anything can be a robustness check, but we're going to narrow it down using the definition from Simonson and co-authors to a reasonable specification. And a reasonable specification, they define it as a sensible test of the research question that is expected to be statistically valid, and it's non-redundant with other specification tests. And basically, this we're going to assume that everything in the paper is reasonable, but maybe only a fraction of the paper is reproducible. So one thing reproducers can do is increase the size of the feasible sets of robustness check, or another thing that they can do is to, within the side of feasible and reasonable, propose a reasonable robustness test. And basically, this is the platform allows you to enter this in a fairly standardized way, where you basically point out where are the lines of code that you're going to change, what's your rationale, justify that why would it be reasonable, and then discuss the results. All this in a fairly standardized fashion. We see this as as the next step of very exciting things that can be done once you achieve computational reproducibility. And these initial robustness checks are, again, just the first step. But if you want to take it even farther and maybe write a paper based on additional robustness checks that require more complexity that what the SSRP allows, you're gonna be able to use the Institute for Replications materials and guidance for this. So and that's what Abel is gonna talk later on. But so now you're done doing the reproduction again as a student or as an independent researcher. What do you get out of this? Well, I think you get something pretty exciting, I would say. You have generated a reproduction. This reproduction report is going to give you a summary, like what we have here on the left. This summary is going to have a digital object identifier, so it's going to be it's going to be citable, and you're going to be able to claim credit for what you did here. It's going to describe your summary of the claim, your assessments. It's going to have links to your improvements, and this is just going to be the summary, because the entire report can be accessible as an HTML file on all the stages. So basically, you can share your entire reproduction through all the stages, and basically you can share with the original authors to have a collegial discussion around certain issues. We provide guidance on how to have that. You can add this reproduction summary with its DOI to your CV, maybe if you're applying to grad school or something like that, to show that you have done in-depth work. You can discuss it. We have a forum for it, and you can cite it, and basically build on the shoulders of people that came before you. So that's basically the social science reproduction platform. We want, again, researchers and students around the world to use it in the classrooms. Our goal is to bring this proposed standardization to leverage this very large amount of knowledge that is created and deleted or lost every year. So we invite researchers and students and instructors to use it. There's going to be a link there. We also put a fair amount of effort into generating this guidance because, of course, you're going to have questions about the different stages. You're going to have questions about how to assess things. As an instructor, you might want to know how do you grade this in your homework, or how do I conduct collegial exchanges with the co-authors. So we're going to have different chapters for the different stages or for the specific topics, and we encourage people to go look at the reproduction, at the guidance, but also to contribute. These guidance are open source documentation. We don't have the final word on all these definitions that we have come up with or borrow, and we want people to contribute and participate in this project. We have also generated a forum where people can ask questions and basically have conversations around specific issues of reproducibility. You might ask the community whether or not you're getting the claim right, whether or not you have access to the right files. Is there anything specific about your exercise that you're missing that people might be able to help you? And we want that that forum to be used for this purpose. And in terms of who's using the SSRP, the SSRP has been around for a little bit more than a year now, and we're excited to see that 125. No, this is a little bit dated, but in this report, 125 reproductions has been logged. Now we have, I think, north of 150. These reproductions have been focused on 91 papers, and in total, more than 200 claims have been assessed. So that, I think that's pretty exciting. They are concentrated in North America and Chile, and with a little bit in China and I think Nicaragua, but everybody in the world is welcome to use it and to share their knowledge in it. And we're going to use that knowledge to inform what are the reproducibility of different fields and subfields. So right now, depending on how we aggregate this information, we can see that a picture is starting to emerge when there's a fair amount of heterogeneity, but an important fraction of papers are highly reproducible. Again, this is a selective sample, but it is starting to show us how we can learn, and the more people use it, the more we can learn about this, and the more other people will be able to learn. Because in a upcoming period, we're going to basically release this properly anonymized data for other people to join our meta research agenda on this topic. So with that, I just say thank you and leave my contact information in case you want to chat about this or are interested in using it or have any questions that would like to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. Let's see. Abel, are you? There we are. All right, let me introduce our third speaker. Abel Berger is from the Institute for Application. He's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Ottawa. He received his PhD in economics at the Paris School of Economics. During the academic year 2013-14, he was visiting in the Department of Economics at UC Berkeley. I see a theme through all of our biographies. He also visited at the London School of Economics. His current research interests center around applied economics. He's worked on different topics, including development, health, and labor economics. Current projects include the evaluation of the health and economic consequences of prostitution in Southeast Asia and the examination of the effects of terrorism and mass shootings. So why don't you take it away?
Thanks a lot for everybody for putting this together and for the introduction. Here we go. So I'm delighted, really happy to be able to talk to you about the Institute for Replication. So this is a project that we started in January, so it's been a good 10 months now. So this is joined with Anna Dreber, who's in Stockholm, Fernando, who just introduced the SSRP, and Ted Miguel. And basically, our goal at the Institute for Replication is to generate and promote replications and reproductions. And we started with modest objectives for our first year, and we decided that what we wanted to do is to generate as many replications as possible and many reproductions as possible for studies that are published in top journals in economics, political science, finance, and hopefully in the future we're going to be able to add more discipline. And if just, you know, to start things off, if you want to learn more, you can have a look at our website. So our main goal was to have this website where we're able to document existing replications, the replications that we're going to be generating, but also to provide authors or researchers who are interested in doing replications some documentation. So I'll go through this over this presentation. But before, I just want to take a step back and kind of explaining why we thought that we needed an Institute for Replications. Replications in social sciences are quite rare. In economics, for instance, we're talking about something like 20 publications per year. So here we're talking about comments that are published or pure replications. The focus is also usually when there's large projects, so the OSEF or the work by Colin Cameron co-authors, the focus is usually on experimental studies. So we were thinking that we're currently in an equilibrium in economics, political science, and social sciences in general, an equilibrium where there's not enough, or at the very least, there's not that many replications. And we were thinking, okay, so why is that the case? And how can we improve the number of replications? And we thought maybe this has something to do with the lack of incentives, maybe for some researchers, early career researchers or PhD students, maybe this is because they think that this could be harmful for the career. So all in all, we think that we're in this bad equilibrium where the supply and potentially the demand for replications is just not there. And there's also this lack of norms and guidelines. So we thought that what we needed is kind of a big push in terms of developing documentation, a platform like SSRP, and what has been also talked previously, but also in terms of just generating many more replications. And here's what we have in mind in terms of how to generate these replications. Okay, just before I get to this, what do I mean by replications? So there's a lot of definitions out there. And what I want you to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation is the following. Basically, when I use the term reproduction, what we have in mind is more push button replication, meaning just reproducing the codes or just running the code, and reproducing the numerical results. So basically you run the code, you use the same data and the same code, and you try to reproduce the results and you check whether the results are exactly the same as what is reported in the article. So this is reproduction. This is conceptual reproducibility, if you will. And then there's everything else, as Fernando just explained. There's this huge set of possible robustness checks. There's the possibility also to potentially use the same data but different codes. There's also this idea of conceptual replications where you're using new data, new code. So here, when we talk about replications, we have in mind all these things. We have these in mind, basically doing robustness, also potentially using the raw data, but then recoding everything. And also this idea of potentially using new data and new codes. So when I say replication, I have in mind something like this. And over the past 9-10 months, in terms of the replication we've generated, we're talking mostly about robustness replications. And we're talking also about using the raw data and using different codes. So basically trying to follow the same procedures as were used in the study, but recoding everything from scratch. So these are the two types of replications that are currently ongoing or completed. Okay, so as I was saying, we're trying to generate and promote replications as much as possible. And the first thing we wanted to do is determine a set of studies that we think could be or should be replicated. Now it's very complicated to choose which is the set of studies that we should focus on. So we had to make some decisions. And in the future, we might change over time which type of studies we're interested in replicating. But right now, we selected some leading journals in political science and economics. And we're interested in studies that just got published. So we're talking about studies that were published in 2022 or forthcoming. So we're not really going in the past, sorry. Then the first step, what we do is to check whether the data and codes are available. So this is through collaborations with data editors at top journals. This is also internally, we would look at whether the data and codes would be available, whether there's a complete reproduction package, whether the README file is clear enough. And if the data is accessible and the codes are provided, then we would try to replicate it. And I'll explain how we're doing this in a second. If the data and codes are not available, then we try to contact the authors or we document on our website why the data is not available and how can a potential replicator could actually obtain the data. So sometimes this is provided in the README file, sometimes it's not. And if it's not, we would contact the original authors to try to get a sense of why this information was not provided and how can potentially someone obtain the data. Okay, so then what we have is a set of studies that have been reproduced internally or through the data editors themselves. And then we want to replicate as many studies as possible within that set of studies. So what we ended up doing is to have a board of editors. They're not really editors, but I'll refer to kind of a board of top political scientists and top economists covering all the subfields within these disciplines. We give them the list of studies that we have that have been reproduced and where the data and codes are available or can be publicly downloaded. And we ask them, who could be a potential replicator for this? It can be a graduate student, can be a postdoctoral student, it can be a colleague, it can be a researcher, tenure, not tenure, it can be anyone. But we ask them basically, could you provide the names of potential replicators? This is kind of very similar to thinking about like who could have reviewed this paper. Here the studies are published, but we're interested in finding potential replicators. Then we receive a list of names for many of these studies. And what we do is the institute contacts these potential replicators and asks them to replicate the study. I'll come back to the incentives in a moment. But here the replicators, you want to think of people who have a PhD or are about to complete a PhD. They can team up, so sometimes it will be the advisor with a PhD student. They have a good knowledge of the literature, this is their domain, and they could have potentially refereed the paper. And we're going to ask them to do replication. We tell them the results have already been reproduced. The data and codes are available or can be publicly downloaded. Please do something more. Do a robustness replication, or potentially use the raw data and recode everything yourself. So this is what we ask them to do. So that's our first way of trying to generate replications. We also now have a partnership with Open Philanthropy in which we do not select the studies. So here it's Open Philanthropy who's interested in getting some studies being replicated. So they choose the studies and then they ask us to try to find replicators. And here they provide a financial, so a payment to the replicators. So here, think of this as another way of trying to generate replications for a different set of studies, where potentially these studies are either older seminal studies, or they're in the range of fields or, let's say, interests that Open Philanthropy cares about. Okay, so this is the second way we try to generate replications. And hopefully over time, we're going to be able to develop other partnerships with other NGOs or other organizations or private companies who are interested in replicating studies. The third way now that we're trying to generate replications is the following. So we have our first replication games in Oslo at the end of the month. And we expected a small number of participants, but it's growing over time. And now we're about 70 participants. Many of them are going to be in person in Oslo. And I'd say the majority are actually professor, although there's many graduate students. And here what we do is we're going to have a team of 4 or 5 researchers. Usually there's at least 1 professor per team. And they all work on similar topics. Let's say US elections, or if it's in economics, let's say development economics. And we team them up, and then we're going to assign a study to this team. And the theme of study is the same that we have for the board of editors. So these are publicly available data, they've been reproduced, and usually they're not super complex in terms of how long it takes to run the codes. So think of this as more papers that use publicly available data, and the codes are not super complicated. And here's the study, or let me say, here's the goal of the games. So we've already created the teams, we've already assigned them a study, and they can read the study, they should familiarize themselves with the replication package, with the codes, etc. Then they're gonna have a meeting before the games where they kind of develop a game plan. This is what we think we're going to be doing during the games. And then on October 27 is the games. So we're going to be all day long. Everybody's going to be here, going to be there in Oslo. And each team is going to have 8 hours to work and do as much as possible on their replication. Myself and Anna Dreber, we're both going to be in Oslo. We're going to be going from team to team, answering questions, just talking about different possibilities, what they should be doing, etc. And then that's the end of the games. And then in weeks later, they can wrap up the replication, and then they can send us a report, or they can put their information, the replication that they've done, into SSRP. So think of this as a third way to generate replications. The other thing I should mention is when we find replicators, we give them incentives, and we try to make it very clear that they can remain anonymous. If they use the platform, they can remain anonymous up to 4 years, but if they don't use the platform, they can remain anonymous for pretty much the rest of their lives if they want. The thing that's very important also, we're telling them that they don't have any incentives, or we're trying to remove the incentives to show that the results do not replicate. The goal is not to show that something is not robust. The goal is to test whether the results are robust or not. So here what we're going to be doing, so as soon as we have a replication that is completed, we send it to the original authors for an answer, and then we release at the same time the answer and the replication publicly through our discussion paper series. But what's important is we're going to both release positive and negative replications. And I just want to go back a bit to this bad equilibrium I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. Right now, we're in an equilibrium where there's not that many replications. And unfortunately, virtually all the replications we're seeing are negative. And I think we need to move out of this equilibrium in terms of quantity, quality of replications, but also in terms of disseminating those that are positive. I think often we try to replicate a study before working or using the same data, and we find that the results are successful or successfully replicate, but we don't really disseminate this. So this is one of the things that we're trying to change here. We have a conflict of interest policy, but the other thing I want to mention is we actually let the replicators choose how to replicate. So they can choose whether to take the raw data and kind of recode everything. They can choose whether they want to do robustness checks or which robustness checks. So each paper is very different, and it's going to become clearer for the replicator who's an expert in the field which type of replication that person should do. In terms of incentives that we give to replicators, it's going to depend on which of the 3 different ways of generating replications. But one of the things we do, we offer co-authorship, for instance, to a meta paper where we're going to be combining all the replications. So this is one of the incentives we're giving to replicators in order for them to engage into the replication. We're also putting together a lot of different special issues or conferences where we're going to be discussing their replications. So for instance, we have a special issue with research and politics. So the call for papers ended last week and received tons of proposals. So really looking forward to putting this together. There's going to be also a special issue dedicated to replication at the Canadian Journal of Economics. And we have on our webpage also a list of journals that are interested in publishing replications. So we're also trying to change a bit the demand for replications from the journal sides, working with the editors. Okay, let me skip this. Okay, going forward, we're hoping we're going to be able to expand to other disciplines, to other journals. So right now you can have a look at the list of journals and the list of studies that were looking for replicators, whether yourself you're interested in potentially replicating a study, or maybe with your student or teaching using SSRP in class and finding potentially a list of studies where the results have been reproduced, the data and codes are available, and this will be potentially a good study to try to have your students replicate. So this is what we're thinking going forward. Okay, last slide, just to give you a bit of an idea. So as I said, we started in January. Right now we have 65 ongoing replications. We have 5 that are completed that we sent to the original authors, and we're soon going to be disseminating them through our discussion paper series. As I said, we have a replication game in Oslo. Mid 2023, we're probably going to do a replication game in Ottawa and Montreal. There's also some interest in doing replication games in Germany and France. So we're hoping in a year from now to be able to do this. So if this is something that you would like, the replication games to come to your institution, please reach out to us. We'd be delighted to talk about the possibility of doing this. And yeah, really looking forward to your questions, comments, suggestions. And again, thanks a lot for people at BITS, UC Berkeley Library, and everybody who's been together, putting together this great seminar series. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So, so we're really strong, interesting presentations, and I want to open the floor to questions to any of the presenters. You can put your questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you and you can unmute. So yes, you can, yes. Ted, yes, you can ask a question. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask something quick. First, those are great talks, and it's wonderful just to hear about all the progress in so many different dimensions. I wanted just to direct something to Abel, and just if he could give maybe a little bit of the backstory on how the idea for replication games came together. And I mean, such a cool concept and something so novel in this space, in really building a community activity. And just wanted to know if there was more of a backstory of how the idea came together, and how you see it evolving and maybe institutionalizing it going forward.
Yeah, that was that's a discussion I had with someone a year ago. That person is a close collaborator who's going to remain anonymous. But basically, I asked him whether he thought it would be a good idea to launch an institute for replication, whether he would be interested in doing a replication himself, maybe with a graduate student. And the answer was no. And I was quite surprised. He thought that it would be very complicated to start such an institute, and that he himself was not interested in doing the replication. And what he said was basically because of the reputational cost. But what he said is, if you put me in a team with 4 or 5 other people, and this become kind of an activity or a game or something like this, then I'm more than interested in doing replications. Basically, if this becomes something social, just kind of for fun or part of an event, then I'm definitely he's going to be interested in showing up and spending 1 day or more days trying to replicate this thing. And that person gave me the example of what they do in engineering and what they do in the hard science, where they do have a full day where there's tons of PhD students and postdocs that meet, and they try to develop new cool stuff. So it can be, anything related to engineering, can be any type of innovation. And they do this a lot in France, they do this a lot in many different countries. So he said, you should do this, but basically do it for replications, where people are not going to feel afraid of writing a study or, that is criticizing or reassessing a previous study by someone in their field who's potentially a potential reviewers for his own studies, but instead trying to make this more into something fun and more of an event. So that kind of came up out of this conversation, trying to convince someone like this, a person who's not interested in doing a one-on-one replication, how can I engage this person and bring him into this, the replication universe? And I thought doing games would be an interesting way of doing this. And I guess, the second part of your question is where this is going. I don't really know. We started doing this in Oslo. I expected 5-10 people, and now we're declining, which is keeping receiving emails of people who are interested in doing this. There's a lot of interest. People contacted me and asking to do this in their own institution, country. So hopefully this can become institutionalized. Hopefully we're going to learn something. We're going to have a positive experience in Oslo, and building from this and improving the way we're doing this. And so hopefully it's going to be a success. And I think it's a great way to get replications. So we have 70 participants. We're going to have 15 replications. In economics, there's like 25 per year, or sometimes 50. It depends how you define replications. So if we can get 15 just with an event like this, with a budget of $0, I think it's could be great.
That's great. I just want to say that I think your kind of connection to like a hackathon, when engineers get together and hack something is a great one. And then the other, the element of the kind of the social dimension is exciting, as well as what you said, that doing something in a group kind of, especially for younger scholars, I think protects them a little bit if there are concerns that they can't replicate something. I mean, it's a little bit of like a sort of safety in numbers kind of situation, which I think a lot of the early successful replication attempts, even those organized by the Center for Open Science, have this sort of like large numbers of crowdsourced replications around the topic. And it seems to be a very effective strategy for changing norms. So anyway, just congratulations on really coming up with that idea.
So I'm monitoring the chat and looking for hands up. In the meantime, while you're preparing your questions, I have a number. Oh, Carson, go ahead, you first.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I'm wondering for Project Here, you guys are already partnering with a lot of great organizations, and I think that the network is super important when trying to scale up an approach like this. Who would you like to partner with that you're not already partnering with, and why? And I guess Abel and Fernando could answer that question as well. It could be specific or general.
Okay, yeah, thanks for asking. So I kind of love that question because we like collaborating with people, and so we invite it, welcome it, and seek it. So I guess I have to say, any opportunity to do anything with bits anytime we love. So that's one comment.
Answer.
But then sort of more specifically, we have a special niche that we're trying to target as our audience, and it's sort of successful and sort of a challenge. That the immediate conversation partner for us is instructors, like people who are teaching courses, like Ann Nurse, who we can sort of show, here's how we did it in our classes, and here's how it works, and here's how to spread it out over a semester, and then encourage them to do that in their classes. And so, number one, we're always looking for ways to connect with that audience of instructors. But then number two, we wish it could get more systematic beyond just individual instructors. We would love to have like a critical mass from some department that would come and say, oh, so they all get the idea of how this kind of instruction works, and then they go home and they coordinate in their programs. Okay, well, in our intro class, we'll do these simple little things, and then in the next class, we'll build on this piece of what you can do, and then by the time they write their senior thesis, they'll be all up and running. And that's not exactly like a particular entity to collaborate with, but that's sort of a kind of connection that we would like to make, to somehow get at a departmental or programmatic level coordination going on. There's few examples of that, but they're hard to come by. And the flip side is, if you try to do too much coordination and centralization, you risk killing it. Like the day the projecteer dies is when some dean for instruction goes to the department and says, you guys have to do this. Because I know how I react when the dean for instruction tells me what I have to do. So we still want it to be sort of individual, organic, in a way, grassroots, but to have it gel somehow, get coordinated.
So Fernando or Abel, do either of you want to address this question?
Sure, happy to. I think instructors. I was contacted some time ago by someone who is teaching a graduate class, and every year they reproduce and replicate something like 15 studies published in the AEA papers and proceedings. These are very short papers with usually just one table. I think it's a great assignment for reproducing and replication. And it just shows you that replications are done all the time. And it's just a question of trying to make it public, trying to standardize with the SSRP, and that we're all talking the same language. But I would say instructors, and also just being open. The collaboration just pop up out of nowhere. And you know, it sounds stupid, but we're willing to collaborate with pretty much anyone or any type of organizations interested in, and you know, even a company, if they're interested in getting a replication on a specific study or done in marketing, and this is how they're thinking of spending their money, or it would be good if we can replicate that study first. And I don't think it's that expensive or complicated. So any type of collaborations or partnerships, honestly, I think would be incredibly useful for us.
Yeah, I would also like to basically instructors, echoing everybody, more targeted. I would really like basically every single instructor in courses like this in Latin America to, like, we should do like a focus group or like a meeting and say like, hey, why is not everybody using this thing right now? I would really like to understand what are the barriers, what are their limitations, how to make it easier. I do hope that I know that in Chile, in Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, there are so many excellent students that can show their work through this path, and I would love for that to happen. And another audience, I would like to bring in journal editors. I attended the other day an excellent series put up by people in Cornell with editors from Econometrica, Journal of Finance, and Economic Inquiry. And they were all saying like, yeah, we really want to do this, but we don't have the funds. And I was just like sending links for the social science reproduction, saying like, you should just use this thing, and at least you don't get it beforehand, but at least you get it after it. So editors and instructors, particularly in Latin America.
Just maybe, you know, following on this, what Fernando is saying is, I think it's quite impressive the amount of work you can do in terms of reproduction of every single study being accepted at a given journal for almost no cost at all. I mean, there's some journals, political science, that do it with a grad student. And it's just, you know, making sure the do file and or the scripts are clean, documentation is good. There's now, you know, Lars and many other data editors that put together a template for the README file. I think these things are very low cost. And if we would all be using the same template as a README file for every single reproduction package that we have, it just decreases the cost for researchers as well. And I think it would just, you know, you start a project, you ask your RA, okay, clean the data, use this template. And this would just streamline a lot. And I think journal editors sometimes are worried that it costs a lot of money. And I'm not saying it doesn't, like there's a cost to have a data editor, but there are other options. You don't need to have nothing or a data editor that reproduce everything. There's tons of things in between that are very low cost that can be done. And it's this, yes. I mean, I agree 100% with Fernando. I think collaboration with editors would be super useful on both hands.
So on a different kind of question, are there connections between reproducibility work and diversity, equity, and inclusion? Who would like to? I see you nodding, Fernando. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So let me start with the negatives, because there could be negatives here. That the more we add requirements, the more we add costs. Implicitly, we're basically saying we're adding barriers to people who are less well resourced. So that could add a barrier and reduce diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's a valid threat. And whenever we design these tools and these guidelines and protocols, where we have in mind trying to reduce the cost, but we might fail. So it's important to be aware of that. But on the positive side, I think that at least it's my belief that should be tested more rigorously. But I believe that academia still it's it's very far from what I think it's the ideal, the scientific ideal, where there are low barriers to share knowledge. There's low barriers to share the entire body of knowledge. So when I was in grad school in Chile, like I still remember vividly like how nervous I was when I forwarded an email to my professor for him to ask a famous economist in Chicago to provide access to a data set, and it was so like touchy-feely. It was a very complicated phenomenon. So I think the more we empower minorities, or the more we empower underrepresented groups with the language, with the tools, that they're entitled to these reproduction packages, this is part of what the research output is. The more access they have to knowledge, the more access they have to the production and the consumption of knowledge. So again, untested belief, but I see a clear mechanism there.
Abel or Richard, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think that there's a cost to asking people to provide a very clear and concise replication package. I mean, it takes a lot of time, and I think some people at top university just ask a research assistant to do it. At my institution, this doesn't fly. You have to do it yourself. We just don't have the funds, for instance. And I think someone at an institution in a developing country would face a similar problem. So there's this, but I also I agree with Fernando. There's also positives. I mean, I remember being an undergrad at in Montreal. It was literally impossible for me to get access to any type of data. And I would read a study, would be like, wow, they have access to this data set. That's amazing. And I think right now it's way easier, at least for students. You have the replication package, and it tells you how, even if the data is not there, it tells you how you actually can access or request this data. And this is information that before was incredibly hard to get, especially for people who were not connected properly or were not part of whatever network you need to have. And I think now it's way, way, way easier. I just see it over time with my own students and people in developing countries, RAs or people who contact me. So it's not perfect, but I think overall there's a positive effect of having, or making compulsory to share data and codes, or at least information on how to obtain the codes and data.
Do you want in, Richard, or should
I'll give you an example of sort of lowering barriers to entry. This was just one paper I happened to notice. It was a paper in the JPE in 2014 or 2015, something like that. And it was not documented, that there was no data or code available for it. But it did, typical brief description, supposedly, of what they did and where the data came from, which was like, not nearly enough to allow somebody to really understand it and reproduce it. But the noticeable thing was talking about what data they used. So in the paper, they said, oh, we used CPS data from this year to this year. And then they went on. So like, okay, CPS data, anybody can go and get that. That's totally transparent and open. But then there's a footnote. Said, well, actually, I didn't just use the CPS data. I used the version of the CPS data that my friend from grad school had cleaned and transformed in some really nice ways. And that's what I started with, period. And so that's like a non-starter if you didn't go to graduate school with those guys. And so that's just like an example of all this business about making things transparent, lowers those barriers to entry. Like you can, if just by making things available, well documented, not skipping the steps like all these transformations that your friend did, that makes it, people from out of the country or from less well-known institutions, much easier for them to get a toehold.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes. So let me again, you can either write in the chat or you can put up your hand. Okay, or we can go to one of my exciting questions. Let's do that. So as someone who teaches this in an undergraduate institution, and I know there'll be other instructors listening, what do you think is the most challenging part about teaching reproducibility to students? Do you want to start this time, Richard, and we can go the other way around?
So what's the most challenging part? It's like way easier than not teaching reproducibility. I'll put it like that. So it took a while to figure out how to get things to work and what to expect from students and how to communicate that to them. So I guess I'm really turning your question on its head and promoting sort of how effective it is. And I'll just give one concrete example about what makes it effective is when students come to me for help on a project, they've got all their stuff up on OSF and they come to so they'll print out the results of a regression and some variables got dropped and they'll hand me this piece of paper and say, why did those variables get dropped? And like, I don't know, but if I can go and download their stuff from OSF onto my computer and I run their stuff and I can see exactly what's going on. And then I'm able to offer some really effective advice. Whereas, I mean, I think back to when I didn't do that, I was like all the time just out to sea. So okay, so that was really quite a clever reframing of your question, wasn't it? But so there's some startup costs, retooling their exercises and assignments a bit. That's a bit of a startup cost. And then there's a startup cost every semester with students that they've got to right away start working in scripts and understanding relative directory paths. But it's not that hard. So I totally dodged it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Abel, do you want to jump in?
It's hard to answer this question. I think to me, it's a different question. It's students don't get in most programs a course on the ethos of science. And I think the second you start talking about reproduction and replication, you have the duty, or you have to do it because nobody else did, to kind of talk about the ethos of science. And personally, it takes me a lot of time. I guess I could be more concise, but it sort of forces you to teach other things that should be covered in other courses, in my opinion. And I'm like, again, I'm like Richard, I'm not really answering the question, but to me, it sounds stupid, but for instance, right now I'm teaching a course in graduate class in development economics, and now I want them to do as an assignment using SSRP reproductions. But I have to spend a lot of time talking about things that are not related to development economics, that are not related to reproduction, but just to try to explain them why it's so important to do this. And I feel like this should have been done elsewhere in other classes. Like, so it's not a great answer, but I'll stop there. I'll let Fernando, maybe he's gonna think about something else.
All right, Fernando, you've got about 30 seconds.
I do think that there's like an entry cost, but as you pay it, it becomes easier. That's the main reason. We're surrounded by inertia, and I speak by my own experience. So we just need to pay some entry cost, and then it's just easier.
Okay, we are about out of time. I so appreciate our panelists and our hosts. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation today. Does anyone from BITS want to jump in, or shall I just call it here?
I can just maybe say one last word. First of all, just huge thanks to our speakers, 3 speakers, and Anne, to you for really doing such a great job of keeping us moving forward. I also want to thank our funders one more time at the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and remind those who are participating that we're going to have our next session of this open research seminar on October 27th. It's entitled Normalizing Reproducibility, the Experience of the World Bank Group and DIME. And it's just going to be a really exciting event, and you're going to hear about how a lot of the ideas we talked about today are being implemented at scale by a very important economic research and policy organization. So anyhow, again, thanks to everybody. We look forward to seeing you in a few weeks again.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.